Should Americans pay reparations for slavery? Or those whose ancestors owned or exploited slaves be made to compensate those descended from the victims of slavery? In California recently, the state legislature considered several bills that sought to do precisely that. A task force set up by the state legislature recommended making direct cash payments worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to anyone in California descended from an African slave. According to the California task force, these payments weren't just about righting the wrongs of the past. Giving out hundreds of thousands of dollars to Californians descended from slaves was also, they said, about compensating for inequality today. Not to be outdone, the Prime Minister of Barbados, one Maya Motley, has suggested that her island state of 280,000 people is owed what she claims is $4.5 trillion in compensation for slavery. That works out as a cool $17 million for every person living in Barbados now. Don't worry though, Mrs. Motley doesn't expect this sum to be paid out in one lump sum payment. Paying out $17 million per person in Barbados over several years would be fine, according to the leader of that island state. Meanwhile, in Missouri, one congresswoman is reportedly demanding $14 trillion. That apparently is compensation for all the unwaged work undertaken by slaves in America between 1619 and 1865, plus, of course, the interest. Are these ideas daft? Yes. Are they idiotic even? Undoubtedly. But one thing I've learned is that today's daft ideas, if unchallenged, have a nasty habit of coming back as tomorrow's orthodoxy. It's important to challenge bad ideas before they take hold. So here's why the idea of reparations is not just wrong, but why it's a really, really bad idea. If there were to be reparations, who would qualify? Elizabeth Cash Green died in 1975 in Arkansas. She was apparently the last person born into slavery in the United States. So when people talk about reparations for slavery, what they really mean is paying those descended from slavery. There are plenty of African Americans living in the United States that aren't descended from slavery. Barack Obama, for example, America's first black president, was the son of a Kenyan. Would the former president, with his home in Martha's Vineyard, qualify for reparations payments? Making direct cash payments to those descended from the transatlantic slave trade means we need a way of establishing who was and who wasn't the direct descendant from a slave. I suspect we might need more than self-identification to determine who qualifies. In the name of countering racism in 2024, are we really going to want to classify everyone by race using some sort of DNA test? Now, if it's hard enough to establish who qualified for compensation, who would be liable to provide that compensation? Is every American not descended from the transatlantic slave trade going to pay? Why should a new arrival in America from, say, India or Korea be expected to pay compensation? And why only Americans? Over 90% of those transported across the Atlantic weren't enslaved in North America, but in the Caribbean and in South America. If seeking reparations for slavery is your thing, why not invoice Brazil and the West Indies? If we're going to target only those that had ancestors that benefited from slavery, we might have to track down the descendants of the King of Dahomey in present-day Benin in West Africa. It's estimated that in the 1750s, the King of Dahomey was making enormous money selling African slaves. And why stop at the transatlantic slave trade? Until the British waged war against the slave trade, slavery existed almost everywhere. Arab states took slaves from Europe and Africa. Should they be sent a bill too? Reparations are not only sought by those wanting compensation for slavery, but for the apparent sins of Western colonialism too. In fact, the further back in time that European colonialism recedes, the greater seems to be the pressure for paying some sort of reparations. Belgium is constantly badgered to compensate the Congo. Many on the left in Britain propose reparations for India and Africa. Now, if anyone's going to claim reparations for having been colonised, I would like reparations from Italy for colonising my native Britain for 400 years, plus, of course, 2,000 years of interest. And what about the Normans from France, who savagely enslaved my ancestors after 1066 and all that? It's time for Paris to pay up. The notion that you or I must be held liable for the sins of our fathers, let alone for the sins of our great-great-great-great-great-grandfathers, is absurd. Or at least it ought to be absurd to the modern Western mind. Do you really imagine that 2 American babies born today should be defined from birth by how the ancestors of one treated the ancestors of the other? Of course not. Who wants to live in a country like that? To think like that is to adopt a primitive, pre-modern mindset. To seek redress from those alive today for the perceived wrongs of their forefathers is not progressive. It's tribal, it's atavistic, it's deeply, deeply regressive. It's also really bad history. The entire reparations movement is built on bad history. Good history explains the past. Bad history and bad historians tell us more about their own current prejudices and preconceptions than they do about the past. Britain and America were not uniquely responsible for slavery and the slave trade. Slavery as an institution existed almost everywhere for most of recorded history, until Anglo-American civilization stamped it out. Britain's not unique for her role in slavery, but she is unique for her role in ending it. Slavery and serfdom had disappeared long ago in England by the early Middle Ages. Various court cases during the 18th century effectively meant that any slave entering England was deemed to be free. Britain formally outlawed the slave trade in 1807. The historians Chaim Kaufman and Robert Pape have estimated that between 1807 and 1867, Britain spent almost 2% of GDP annually in an effort to stamp out the slave trade. As for America, the United States fought a civil war, easily the bloodiest war in her history, to end slavery. Of course, if those demanding reparations were really animated by slavery, they would be clamoring for action to end the practice as it still exists in parts of Africa and the Middle East today. They don't, of course, because it's not really about slavery or the past at all. The demand for reparations is about a political agenda today. California's task force on reparations made it clear that they seek payments not only as compensation for the past, but to address unfair things that they dislike today. A century and a half after the last American slave was set free, reparations are needed to address its lingering effects, they claim. Of all the bad arguments for reparations, perhaps this one is the worst. Unequal outcomes in America today are not a consequence of slavery. It's not even the injustice of the present system that's responsible. If America in 2024 was an unjust racist society, why do Indian Americans have the highest household incomes of any ethnic group? And why do they earn way more than white Americans, for example? If it was racism that held people back in America today, why do new arrivals in the United States from Nigeria and India thrive? Nigerians living in the United States have higher household incomes than average. It's not racism in the past that explain these unequal socioeconomic outcomes today. It's about personal behavior today. Socioeconomic success comes from having productive time preferences. Now, that's a fancy way of saying learning to work hard and invest now for the benefit tomorrow. It comes from conscientiousness, from showing up on time, from doing what you say you're going to do. It's not the 18th century slave trade that influences any of that. It's you. If you're unhappy or failing in life in 2024, it's likely that it's because of you in 2024, not what your great-great-grandparents did or had done to them. Reparations is a bad idea because it invites people to believe that the key to success lies in victimhood, in getting someone else to do something for us, when what is essential for success is to realize we need to do things for ourselves. If you want reparations, you probably see yourself not as an individual with agency, but as a victim.